waiting for you to say something.
I will ask students, I'll do an exercise with them. So if I say 3 words like Arab, woman, Muslim, like what are the first things that come to your mind? And they'll say things like oppressed, backward, veil.
People go to the media because they feel like, or they kind of absorb what the media has to say because they don't always have a peer from that background to talk with. And it's just kind of like, have an open mind, listen to listen, don't listen to change someone else's point of view.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Gray Area. I'm your host Nora Blackbeard. If you are a new listener, welcome. Every week we get comfortable getting uncomfortable. We slowly push our comfort zones to broaden our knowledge horizons, and we delve into topics and questions some feel better left unread. In this week's hard pill to swallow, I'm prescribing you all with this fact. Middle Eastern and North African women are not inherently more oppressed than their Western counterparts. Of course, I realize that when such statements are thrown around to argue against such a fact, they seem to include disclaimers and exceptions. Well, not all Arab women. Not all Middle Eastern countries are like Saudi Arabia. But contrary to the common misconceptions, strong, independent, free women in Middle Eastern and North African countries are not the exception, but the norm. Now I know some people are going to jump to correct me, but I said what I said. And maybe that is easy enough for me to say, having grown up around many women in my life who are accomplished in many ways, both in their professional and personal lives. But what do I know, having not grown up in an oppressive regime with my rights trampled on and overlooked? After all, women in the Middle East and North Africa do struggle and face discrimination and adversity, and there is much improvement to make there. But while the advancements in women's rights are always highlighted in other countries, for decades, Middle Eastern and North African women have and are still being looked at and discussed in inaccurate and demeaning manners by the Western world. The advancements and strides in gender politics and women's rights in the Middle East and North Africa have existed and continue to be improved upon, yet the many ways we are still misrepresented and made to be seen as weak and in need of protection is still proving difficult to combat. One of the West's defining characteristics has been its savior complex, and Middle Eastern and North African women have been at the center of this mentality. Recently, it has become increasingly difficult to label and attribute some of the misconceptions that many in the Western world still carry. Yet, there is no shortage of the many misapprehensions of the current state of gender politics and women's rights in the Middle East and North Africa. Whether it be education, healthcare, childcare, or economic freedom, the conversation surrounding our women's rights in the Middle East and North Africa has been one that highlighted the failures and ignored the successes. Before I officially begin this episode, I would like to preface a few things. When I'm speaking about some of these countries in the Middle East and North Africa, I want everyone to remember that these countries, just like any others, are not a monolith. So, not all countries in the Middle East and North Africa are making the same strides, and some aren't improving at all. But again, that is something that is already shown in the media. So, shall we begin? One of these supposed continued failures is surrounding women's education. You would think the success of the women in the West's educational institutes would have hinted at just how wrong these misconceptions were, but I guess what more of a perfect image of a damsel in distress than one who can't read or write? Look, I'll be the first to admit that women in the Middle East and North Africa can be exposed to dangerous patriarchal systems that often deny them the right to equal educational opportunities. But these same countries have been putting hours and hours of work and having something to show for it. While in countries like the United States, we can still be seen arguing whether or not the gender gap exists, women in the Middle East and North Africa are pursuing STEM degrees and securing lifelong careers in thrilling new fields. And would you believe it? According to the UAE Ministry of Finance website, women are not only leaving behind legacies in higher education, but they also excel in comparison to men, making up around 70% of university graduates. I'll say it again and again. The women in these countries are not sitting idly in their towers waiting for Prince Charming to save them. They are picking up their own swords and pulling apart statistics and destroying records. They are outnumbering men in educational pursuits and entering STEM fields at a disproportionate rate to their male counterparts. And hold on to your pearls and hats, because more women are graduating in the sciences in the Middle East than in Western Europe. The region as a whole is constantly working to achieve gender equality in schools and university enrollment rates, and taking the right steps towards achieving the United Nations' ambitious goal of ending the gender gap in education globally. So, Middle Eastern and North African countries seem to have figured out the issues surrounding the gender gap within the educational sector. But, despite the vast amount of educated Middle Eastern women, their assimilation into the workforce has been stagnant. If the so-called progressive West is still in the patriarchal chokehold, it is not surprising that Middle Eastern and North African countries haven't quite figured out exactly how to balance cultural norms and gender equality. It is not uncommon to see women in the region not employed even after graduation, regardless of their chosen field of study. Unfortunately, I've seen that in person. Women did not always enter the workplace, and if they did, they ended up leaving to be stay-at-home mothers. This can be attributed to poverty, cultural expectations, personal preference, etc. But even that is changing too. While the region is lagging behind at times, and growing at a slower rate than most of the world, an anonymous study by a Middle Eastern employment agency states that 68% of working women believe that they are being treated equal among their male counterparts in their respective careers. Okay, while one study is not exactly solid proof, it hints that women are slowly getting the rights and protection that they are demanding. For example, you have the United Arab Emirates that is working to close the gender gap in economic participation and opportunity, education, health, and political empowerment. Namely, in high-ranking positions, they have made it mandatory for corporations and government entities to include women on their board of directors. They have also made it so that half of all small and medium-sized sector businesses are handled by women. As shown in Vivian Guillaume's article, The Rise of Women Entrepreneurs in the Middle East, women entrepreneurs run 1/3 of startups in the Middle East, and while only 10% of all internet entrepreneurs are women, experts say that 23% of women run internet companies in the Middle East and North Africa region, and 35% do in the Gulf states. And as Dana El-Daji perfectly sums up the state of Middle Eastern and North African women in business, she, as I did, acknowledges that women business owners deal with their own obstacles in the Middle East, but that is not a Middle Eastern thing, but a woman everywhere thing. Another misconception that ties into women in the workplace is childcare. Since many believe women don't have a chance for an education or a job, they naturally will do housework, which means the country will offer little to no universal childcare. Contrary to what we would assume, there are multiple Middle Eastern and North African countries that offer childcare services for all mothers, working or not. Take Saudi Arabia, for example, where they have worked to build over 200 childcare centers and offer working women over $200 a month of childcare subsidies. In order to accommodate working mothers, they have also put in place labor laws that support part-time work, which includes Social Security, overtime, annual leave, and sick leave. In parts of the UAE or the United Arab Emirates, women are offered 3 months of fully paid maternity leave and are entitled to 2 hours of daily leave for the first year after delivery to nurse their children. Another obstacle for women looking to be mothers can be maternal mortality, as well as sexual and reproductive rights. The former being a topic not given the attention it's due, and the latter being all that anyone can talk about. In many Middle Eastern and North African countries, maternal mortality is about 200 deaths per 100,000 live births, compared to the world average of 400 deaths. And while it is easy to lump up these countries together when it comes to gender equality and women's rights, they are not always on the same page. That is why, While every Middle Eastern and North African country prioritizes a pregnant woman's life over that of her unborn child, only in Turkey and Tunisia is abortion legal without any limit up to 10 to 12 weeks, not requiring the woman to present any consent other than her own. Recognizing the lack of political representation in one's country is not an easy task, but many Middle Eastern and North African countries have not only publicly acknowledged, but they have also been upgrading women's rights in this very matter. Since 2011, nearly every country in North Africa has adopted a gender quota within their government, in which parties are required to appoint a specific percentage of women as candidates for office in order to increase women's representation in politics. In Lily Boulerain's 5 Things You Should Know About Women in Middle Eastern and North African Nations, she talks about how Middle Eastern and North African women are quickly gaining political representation and how before the 2009 municipal elections in Morocco, women constituted 0.5% of total representation in politics. To ensure the continued success of these women, programs and initiatives were created for these women to be trained in the skills necessary to take their rightful places in office. This led to the total representation jumping from 0.5% to 12% in the North African country. And it is far from a coincidence. It is strategic hard work where quotas are set for position in parliament. Some countries setting aside as much as 10% for their parliamentary seats for women, and others reserving between 15 to 25%. Seemingly radical, but an absolutely powerful move. I read that Tunisia and Algeria's new electoral law introduced a quota ruling that women should comprise of at least half of the candidates on political party lists. Though there are some that argue whether quotas are actually efficient in creating representation for women in politics, I believe there's a difference here. They're not just creating a quota for women in the parliament, but they are creating a quota for having candidates in their political party lists. Though some experts argue about how beneficial quotas really are to women's representation in politics, I believe this is different, because they are not just creating quotas for how many seats should be filled by women, but also the amount of women that should be on the party lists. This shows they are doing more than just the bare minimum. Now, I know I have filled a big portion of this podcast with numbers, statistics, and facts. I have shown how many countries in the Middle East and North Africa have improved in gender equality, and how they have made conscious decisions to change legislation and cultural norms. All of this is not to say that there are no problems in the Middle East or North Africa. Of course, there is still much change that needs to be made, just as any other country. The distinction here is that Middle Eastern and North African countries are no different from countries in the Western world. Both have made improvements and both are lacking in many ways. It is only that Middle Eastern and North African countries are put under a microscope and scrutinized in a way that distances them from countries of the West. This creates an environment in which Middle Eastern and North African countries are seen as inherently inferior, and gives a chance for Western countries to amplify issues of gender inequality in the Middle East and North Africa, and ignores those of their own countries. The silver lining is that if we are made aware of this, we can stop focusing on comparing countries and perhaps lend a helping hand to those who are actually doing the work for gender equality in their countries. Women. I believe that is where our focus should be. I will leave you with a quote from Nawal el-Saadawi, an Egyptian author and a prominent figure in the feminist world. Women are half the society. You cannot have a revolution without women. You cannot have a democracy without women. You cannot have equality without women. You can't have anything without women. I want to thank everybody for joining me in this episode of Gray Area, and I will see you next time.